Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this glorious and mighty KV-5, which looks quite imposing on the box art. This is the 1/35th scale kit from Takom, and the box is so big and oddly vertical that I had trouble filming it. There's nothing on the back of the box anyway, so let's just get straight to looking at what's inside the box. There are a lot of single track links. I mean, a lot of single track links. There are also a couple of other sprues, you might be surprised to learn, which contain things that aren't track links. There's also a large turret body and a hull body, or tub. I've heard this called a tub anyway. There's also a sprue for an infantry figure, or at least I think it's an infantry figure. It doesn't really look like a tank crew figure. This doesn't look too bad if you ask me, though the mold lines on it are fairly heavy. It shouldn't be too hard to clean him up if you do intend to build him. At this point, I don't think I will though. It struck me as kind of odd to include a figure like this rather than, say, a more tank crew looking guy, but it is still a nice extra, and I may put him together one day, just as a standalone something else to do. The large hull tub, which is an upside down tub, I guess, is a bit unusual that it is upside down, but that's not a bad thing. The details are good and crisp, and I rather like the weld seams on it. This is quite a large part, and I think having this all in one piece will make for a neater looking hull. The turret also comes mostly already together as one big single piece. Like the hull, it's nice and neat, and the weld and cut metal detail is really nice. There is a bit of flash here and there, but nothing that can't easily be dealt with. The rest of the parts on the sprues are also quite good. The moulding is nice and crisp and, as best I could tell, free from any major imperfections. I do expect a high level of quality from Takom, though this is only the second kit I've built from them. So far, I haven't been disappointed. The details here are pretty good. Obviously the KV-5 was never built, so we can't really know if this kit is realistic or not, but the details are still good. There's a lot of big chunky bolts and messy weld seams, things that just shout, "Soviet heavy tank!" There isn't an extreme amount of detail-y parts here, and it is a fairly simple tank, not covered in odds and ends or anything like that. That's not a complaint, and there is still plenty to do in this build. I will admit though that a lot of the time spent on this build was tracks. Did I mention there's a lot of track links? There's a lot of track links. These parts are fairly neat, though pretty much all of them did need some cleanup. There's also this sprue with some clear plastic lenses. Very lensy. One of the cool things about this kit is the gun. This turned aluminium, I assume, part is very neat looking, and I think it looks amazing. This is the sort of thing that you might normally need to buy separately, so it's nice to have one included. I mean, if they didn't include it, there would be no gun, because there isn't a plastic alternative to use, but that's totally fine by me. There's also some very nice photo etch grills. Not really much to say about them, they're just simple grills, but they do look rather good. These very exciting polycaps are also included. I know that's a highlight for most of you. And of course, decals. Not only do we get some Soviet markings, but there are Finnish swastikas also, just in case you want to build the KV-5 as captured by the Finns. In 100 years, when I get around to painting this, I'll probably be doing mine as a Soviet tank. An instruction booklet is of course provided with the kit. On the inside cover it thanks me for all of my contribution on this project, though I didn't contribute. I wonder if this might be some sort of special edition or something. I don't know. Either way, this is a bit nicer than your average set of instructions. The good quality of paper used here makes me think these are meant to be kept. The instructions are also clear and easy to follow. There is a basic painting and marking guide which suggests, I believe, Tamiya paints. Not comprehensive by any stretch of the imagination, but it might be helpful as a starting point. Also, some corrected instructions were included on a slip of paper. I guess that's way cheaper than reprinting the entire booklet, and I do appreciate that they included this, rather than just expecting you to figure it out on your own. It is now time to build. The first step is to glue together this axle-y thing for the idler wheel. There's a thing with a loop on the end of it that needs to be sandwiched between the two main parts. Be sure not to glue this into place, or you'll have a bad time trying to install it on the tank. Then why not attach the idler wheels to that? This is pretty simple. Make sure to line up the little ribby things on the inside between each half of the wheels. Looks very idler wheely. We'll attach that to the hull later. Next, I assemble the drive sprocket. This is keyed to make sure that it goes together nice and neatly. I found I had to apply a little bit of pressure to get the parts to go together all the way. These two discs can then be glued together, which is simple enough. Then, that assembly can be glued to the outside of the drive sprocket. There isn't really anything to guide the position of this, so I'm not sure how the bolty details should be lined up, but I'm also not sure it matters too much. Anyway, that's the drive sprockets done. Very toothy. I put those aside to bond, and then it's time for the return rollers. This is really simple. Just glue the two wheel parts to the mounting pole, obviously making sure that you're gluing the wheels on in the correct order. The outer wheel part should go on the outside. Crazy, I know. I think these look pretty good. More wheels, and suspension arms. This pile of plastic does look a bit intimidating. Maybe less so when all of the bits are laid out a bit more neatly. These road wheels are pretty easy to put together. They're keyed so they go together with no hassle. There is a little bit of play there, but I don't think it's worth worrying about. The hubcap parts, for lack of better words, goes on the outside of the wheel. This is also keyed so you can't really put it on wrong, unless you really deliberately want to. You probably don't though. The inner side has a plate that needs to be glued on too. It's also keyed, but in a different way to the outer part, which helps differentiate between the inner and outer halves of the wheel, so they can't be glued together wrong. Well, they can, but it will obviously not work properly. Once the wheels are together, I glued them onto the suspension arms. The fit here is quite tight, so there shouldn't be any wobbly misaligned wheels on those axles. Now we've ended up with this really big pile of wheels and sprockets, which I guess is also kind of a wheel. I put those aside for now because we won't be doing anything with them for a while. Next, I glue some shackle mounting things to the lower front plate part. I think it's pretty obvious where these should go on the plate. They do take a little bit of nudging to get them nice and straight, but it's not hard to do. The same goes for the rear plate, which is much curvier. Who doesn't like a nice curvy rear? Bots. I leave these to set for a while, and then I attach the shackles. The shackles fit so tightly that I feel comfortable leaving them unglued. I doubt they will come off unless I want them to. And even then, I think I might have trouble removing them. I think it's a good idea to leave these loose until later when they're mounted to the tank, so that you can more accurately judge how they should be sitting. While I've got the rear plate part, I figure I might as well glue the rear convoy light into place. This is one of the clear parts. You might prefer to leave it off. I'm just going to paint over it, so why not glue it on? Then I attach the hatch to the driver's cupola thingy. You might think to yourself, boy, that looks simple. And that's because it is. There is a little bit of detail on the inside of the hatch part, but I'm not sure that it could be easily modelled open. I prefer it closed anyway. Next, I build the machine gun turrets. The machine gun parts can be slotted in from the inside, making sure to put them the right way up. I then add the bottom of the turret. This has the second part to the machine gun mounting so that it won't just fall out of place, so do be sure that you're putting this in the right way. I then glue on the vision devices. This is pretty simple. There are 2 of these turrets, though the instructions do seem to want us to build one now and one later. I built both of them at the same time because why not? I don't see that it's going to hurt anything. They've ended up looking quite turrety, I'm sure you'll agree. The lower front plate is glued into place next. This isn't too difficult, though the part doesn't quite just drop right into place. I needed to apply a little bit of pressure and nudging to get it where it should be. The sides are the important part here. The join between the upper and lower part will be covered up later, though you should try to minimize the gap as much as possible. I follow this with the rear plate. This fits okay. It is a little bit gappy around the sides, but that should be hidden by the drive sprocket and tracks later on. I forgot to turn the camera on while installing the whole bottom, but it is fairly simple to get into place. It didn't quite fit perfectly at the front. It is on the bottom though, so I don't think it's going to be especially visible. Of course, if this really bothered me, I could fix it with putty. I then glue these two bits of plastic together so that they form a bump stop. This is pretty easy, but one of these is definitely not going to be enough, so I do it again and again and again, until there are 16 of them. Before installing those, I attach the final drive parts. This is simple enough. There's a piece of keying for it to glue onto, though it's not keyed to a specific position rotational-wise. Is that a word? It's a word now. It doesn't seem to matter how the bolts are aligned. They'll barely be visible anyway. Obviously, there's one of these for both sides. Then come these. I don't know what you would call them. Mounting pins? These go into place very easily. Let's get back to those bump stops. The ones closest to the final drives are level with the bottom of the hull. The rest going forward down the hull are on a slight angle. You don't really need to worry about that though, because the keying makes it almost impossible to get them on wrong. Once they are all on, it looks pretty neat. I then attach this mud clearing brackety thingy. It's not too hard to put into place, though I realised it wasn't the best idea to put this on before the drive sprocket. As you can see, installing the sprocket nudges the bracket thing out of place. I guess it's better to learn this now than when the glue is set and not being able to get the sprocket into place at all. On the other side, I installed the sprocket first. Why not install the idler wheels next? These aren't especially hard to install, though it did require a little bit of force. I left this unglued for now because it seemed like it would stay on with friction alone. Then I installed the road wheels. These have a sort of hexagonal keying for the suspension arms, so getting them all lined up nice and neatly is easy. It should be quite obvious if you've got them on wrong. Eventually, you'll have all the wheels in place, and then it's time to add more wheels. Smaller wheels across which the tracks would return to the front of the vehicle. I guess you might call them return rollers? These are easy enough to install. There are helpful guide pins to make sure everything is lined up nicely. Speaking of which, if you look down the wheels, you can see that the idler wheels do stick out just a little bit. I didn't think it was quite as bad as it actually was while building this, and if you are building one of these, I recommend you put some effort into making sure the idler wheel sits a bit further in towards the hull. Same with the drive sprockets. I wish I'd thought of that at the time I built this. It would have saved a little bit of frustration later on. Anyway, next I install the driver's cupola that I put together earlier. This is keyed and more or less just drops right into the hole intended for it, which is obviously the one on the tank's left. The right one is too big, and also just the wrong place. It is, however, the right place for this. I guess you might call it a riser. Whatever it is, it's the mount for the hull machine gun turret. This is installed more or less the same way as the driver's cupola. You could then install the machine gun turret if you wanted, and it does look pretty cool. I figured it was a better idea to leave this off while working on the rest of the hull though. I didn't want to accidentally break that machine gun barrel. If it gets broken, I want it to be on purpose, by which I mean I don't want it broken at all. I then install the horn, or I think this is a horn anyway. It goes here at the front right of the hull like so. I then glued this angled thing to the front of the hull. There's a bit of keying here to make sure you get this nice and centered. I'm not sure if there's a certain way up this should go, but it doesn't seem like there is. This does a great job of covering up the joint at the front of the hull, which wasn't too bad, though it was certainly not perfect. I think it looks pretty good. Next, I install the exhausts. There are 4 of these parts, in sets of 2 identical pieces. The difference between these parts is the angle at the end of the pipe. The first 2 go on like so, with one off to the side and the other one in the center on the opposite side to the outermost one, if that makes sense. The other 2 then go into the 2 remaining spots. They do take a bit of nudging to get them to sit nice and straight, but they're fairly simple to install. I then begin work on the tracks. This was one of the most time-consuming parts of the build, and they were a little bit frustrating to put together. Some of the links just seemed to not want to connect with each other in certain orders, so I had to fiddle around quite a lot. The way I did this was to glue together enough track links to make the flat section along the bottom of the tank. I made this long enough to reach from the rearmost road wheel to the second from the front, and I glued that onto the tank. Then I went about putting together 3 million more links. Maybe that's a slight exaggeration. I glued together enough links to wrap all the way around from the rear to the front. I'm sure this could have been done in smaller sections, but I didn't feel like doing that. When doing this, do take into consideration some track sag. You do often see tracks on KV series tanks with a lot of sag, and I don't see why the KV-5 would be an exception. I did actually do a lot more fiddling with this than the video might imply. This was rather time-consuming and a little bit annoying, as anyone who saw the stream where I was building these tracks would have guessed. But I did get them on eventually. I think if I were to do this again, I might try and get some metal tracks. I haven't shown it very well here, but the fit of the idler and drive sprockets caused the tracks to be a bit wonky when viewed from the front or rear, and you can kind of see it from the side, but it could be worse. Once I'd got both track sets on, I added the mudguards. This wasn't too difficult. In fact, after the tracks, it was a refreshing change of pace. I did find I had to apply some lateral gap minimizing pressure to get the parts to sit right up against the hull as they should, but that's not too big a deal. Then I add the headlamp. I'm not entirely sure why the instructions wanted it installed now and not at the same time as the horn, but it is what it is and I can certainly deal with that. Now it's time for some photo etch. These are all simple straight grills. There's no bending or anything that can make photo etch become a bit annoying. Of course, superglue is used here because metal won't melt with plastic cement, which is for plastic, as the name would imply. I may not have got the rear grille perfectly straight, but it is close enough that you can't really tell. There are grills that go on these raised boxy thingies as well. They've probably got a name, but I'm going to be rude and not use it. That's why they call me Rude Herbert. These have recesses for the grills to sit on and they do fit quite nicely, which is obviously what we want. Well, it's what I want. All 3 of these boxy venti parts can then be glued into place. There are 2 outer ones and a central one. It would be pretty difficult to mix these up. A little bit of pressure was needed, but once they're in place they do look rather good. Time for bracing parts. There are mounting slots for these along the mudguards, and there's not too much to it. Just make sure they're properly seated and vertical. They do look nice once they're on. Then comes this piece of bracing. I guess this is called bracing anyway. I managed to break the left one, and it is a little bit bent up as well, but that's okay I suppose. Maybe they crashed into something there. I did also manage to glue on the broken off end piece. The one on the tank's right does look much neater. Even more, slightly simpler bracing goes in place here, just behind the driver's cupola and hull machine gun turret. And then we can add some stowage boxes. These fit nicely between the rearmost brackets. There are pins that mount into the holes on the mudguards here, which ensure a nice neat fit. You could probably omit a couple of these if you wanted, but I wanted all of them. And that's the KV-5 hull completed. It's very good and it does KV-5 things very well. But it does need a turret, so we may as well work on that. I start by gluing the 2, I suppose we could call them gun trunnion bits, onto the mantlet part. This is pretty simple. There is keying to help you avoid messing it up too badly. I did this now because I wanted to give it a good amount of time to bond. This assembly will encounter some pressure and we don't want it coming apart right away. Next, I thrillingly insert the polycaps into the pieces that will eventually hold the mantlet part, and they slot into the holes without too much argument, and the trunnion parts will fit nicely too. I tested. There isn't much to add to the structure of the turret, but we do have to add some parts, like this curved rear wall part. It sat in place so nicely while test fitting that, after test fitting with the turret bottom part, I decided just to glue it right into place. I'm pretty happy with how well it fits. Then why not add the turret front? This part didn't immediately fit quite as well as the previous one, but it does fit. It just takes a little bit of nudging and pressure to make it go together correctly. I follow that by installing the bottom of the turret. I add a bit of extra glue around the edges of this just to make sure that it's securely bonded into place. This is a heckin' chonker of a turret. Now it's time for that big beefy gun mantlet assembly. I press the two outer parts onto the central part, I know those are catchy names for them. That assembly then fits into this larger mantlet part. I test fit it against the turret front to make sure that the inner parts aren't going to hold the entire assembly away from the front plate. When I'm satisfied with it, I add glue. I also used a flat work surface to help apply some pressure. Then, unsurprisingly, I glue that assembly into place. There is keying for this, which makes it quite easy. There is still a slight gap around the base of this, particularly on the left side, but it's not too bad. Once I'm satisfied that's going to stay on, I build the commander's hatch. There's keying on the bottom of the hatch part to help guide positioning. No slightly off-centered hatches for us. There's a hole on one side, and into that I glue this thing. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I think it's a periscope though, but it also kind of looks like an old steam whistle from a locomotive or something. At some point I attached the turret machine gun turret. Turrets on turrets. Glorious. The hatch assembly is then glued into the forward right hole in the turret roof. It fits well, but I did need to apply a bit of downward pressure to minimize the gap around it. Then, for whatever reason, rather than add the other hatch part, I add the lifty things around the turret. There's nothing to guide the ones on the sides of the mantlet, so I kind of had to eyeball the placement of the platey part here. I then glue the hook part on, and then use my tweezers to nudge and twist the part so that it looked a bit more appropriately positioned. This was actually kind of fiddly to get the parts on both sides of the mantlet to line up with each other. I don't think I got it even nearly perfect, but I think I got close enough. I would have liked some kind of keying for this. Around this point there's also some bolty rivet details that are supposed to be glued onto the sides of the mantlet as well, but I omitted them at this point because they looked kind of fiddly, and then I promptly forgot about them. I'm sure nobody will really notice anyway. I moved on to the rest of the lift points, which fortunately do have guide holes. Then of course the lifty parts can be put into place. These are just as fiddly as the previous ones, mostly owing to their size and slightly weird shape. They go on well enough, though they do look a little bit rough. This sort of thing would probably take a little bit of beating in real life and look a bit rough anyway. After that I install the more simple hatch into the remaining hole on the turret roof. This is just as easy as it looks, which is to say quite easy. Next, I install, I think, another periscope in front of the machine gun turret. I suspect this rotates and the small gap around the base of this should be there. Then come the vision devices. These are all the same part. Well, not literally the same part. They clearly can't all be the exact same part if there are 4 of them. Why would you even think that? These go into place nice and easily. This turret is so giant that it's not surprising handles would be included to climb up onto the roof. These go up either side of the turret and are pretty simple to install, though I was a bit concerned that I would break or lose them when I was cleaning them up. They end up looking pretty good though. Finally, I install that fantastic looking turned aluminium gun. Obviously, because this is metal, we're going to need to use superglue, otherwise it's just going to come right back out of the mounting hole, and we don't want that. And with that, the turret is finished and can be attached to the hull via the simple locking tabs, similar to the 2 machine gun turrets. And so that's the KV-5 in 1/35th scale by Takom completed. It has been quite a while since I actually built this, but it was a fun build. Well, the tracks did provide a bit of annoyance and I would be lying if I said they were fun to do, but the rest of it was rather good. I think joining and cleaning up metal track links would have probably been a bit more enjoyable, and made for a slightly better result, but they are a bit expensive, so not every build can have them. Either way, the build was mostly fun and I did enjoy the time I spent building it, which was a fairly long time. It took me a handful of streams to get done. At this point I've forgotten exactly how many, but it was quite a few hours. Not that there was any rush, as evidenced by the time between building and editing the video. I guess that's a lot of words to say I'm quite happy with the result. It's not perfect, but nothing is. I would say the weakest part of this is the tracks, which do look a bit bad when viewed directly from the front or rear. That said, looking at the video it's kind of hard to see, and it probably looks worse to me because I know exactly where the mistakes are. It's not a huge issue at any rate, and it is still a very good looking tank. KV-5 is a bit silly looking, admittedly, but in my opinion it's the good kind of silly. And it's been one of the tanks I've enjoyed the most since playing it in World of Tanks. I know that it was never made in real life, and enjoying a tank that never really existed except in World of Tanks, and obviously model form, is bound to upset certain people. But I'm not worried about them. My concern is having models I enjoy the look of and are fun to put together, and this kit ticks both of those boxes. While I would be hesitant to recommend this kit to a beginner modeler, it wasn't especially difficult to build. I've built so many kits at this point that I might have a warped perspective on what is and isn't beginner friendly, but I would say that somebody with at least a little bit of modelling experience could handle this kit quite easily. It's not overly complex. I think the most challenging bit was the tracks. Still, I greatly prefer this kind of tracks over the rubber band style, and I'm pretty confident that rubber band style tracks would look way worse on this. Mostly because of the track sag, which I think is quite important on this kind of tank. This is one of the rare kits I actually deliberately ordered online instead of impulse buying from a brick and mortar store. I'm not sure how common the kit is, but I'm sure you could find it if you really want it. According to Scalemates, the kit was released in 2014, so it is relatively recent, and it seems in 2015 they released another version with new parts to represent a KV-5 as captured by Germany, which I have to admit does kind of tempt me, but I must resist. I guess that's a lot of waffling to say I think this is a pretty cool kit, and I would recommend it. As I mentioned earlier, I built this over the course of a couple of streams. If you would be interested in watching me build models like this live on stream, head on over to my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/Herbert_Erpaderp, or follow the link in the description below, and give me a follow. You'll be notified when I go live, and we can have us a good time with some models. Or maybe video games, which I also do. I mean, who doesn't? So what do you think? Do you enjoy the original King of Ramming in World of Tanks? That's the KV-5. Do you think the KV-5 is a big, dumb thing? Both? Why not both? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, or found it useful in some way, I would certainly appreciate it if you were to share it with your friends or anybody who might find it interesting. Sharing my videos, in appropriate places of course, is a big help to me. The more views, the better. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing, following, ringing the bell, becoming a patron or YouTube member, and all of the other things you do on YouTube and social media. Links to all of my things are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.